Neuroscientists contend that we don't notice it because the brain actually fabricates vision over the area of the blind spot, constructing a pattern or model that mimics the prevailing background. It's not that the brain simply responds to visual stimuli. Rather, the brain interprets incoming visual data as it actively builds vision. Our motor system works along similar principles. It may seem that our experience of the outside world is instantaneous, but it actually takes milliseconds for external stimuli to transform into action potentials that move neuron by neuron from the peripheral nervous system to the brain, where we experience them as touch or sight or taste. That lag, infinitesimal small though as it may be, would make it impossible for us to successfully navigate the world if we were simply responding to stimuli. Take a swinging racket to hit a tennis ball. As Eagleman notes, if we were to merely react to stimuli, we would always be a few hundred milliseconds behind the ball. Of course, we are able to hit tennis balls for the same reason we're able to cross the street safely or feed ourselves. Not only are our brains hardwired to learn the laws of physics, but that understanding is further refined through a lifetime of watching objects arc through the air with gravitational pull. Together, they enable us to make predictions about when and where the ball will arrive. When the brain creates a model, it anticipates what it is going to view in each moment in time. Before you touch something or before you open your eyes to see someone, something, the brain is already creating an image of what you are about to see, said Nicolelis, adding that there is a critical difference between a brain in a sleep state and one that is awake. For a long time, neuroscientists only recorded the brains of anesthetized animals. For the last 10 years, we are starting to recognize that the state dependence is a key issue in understanding how the brain works. We don't simply respond to sensory stimulus. We rely on internal prediction models, or as the hockey great Wayne Gretzky once quipped, a good hockey player plays where the puck is. A great hockey player plays where the puck is going to be. In that sense, we are all great hockey players when it comes to the physical world. Of course, these models are not fixed. They are constantly updated by a continuous stream of sensory information, which enables us to adjust our models to more accurately predict what is about to happen. But these higher brain regions don't simply build models to compare with input streams from the peripheral nervous system. To the contrary, neuroscientists believe that the brain's give and take is so robust that these higher brain regions can actually affect the lower brain regions, priming them to experience external stimuli in a specific way. Each time you imagine the taste of melting butter on fresh baked bread, those lower areas of brain engaged as if you were actually experiencing the situation. Similarly, take the image below. It's not an optical illusion. It's actually a poorly developed old photograph. So what is it? Do you see something resembling a grenade in the lower right-hand corner? Perhaps the beginnings of a pair of faces in the upper right-hand corner? It's tough to say. Though we try to make sense of the image, the brain has little expectation for what it should be seeing. It can't build a model, and so it cannot interpret or adjust the stream of visual information pouring in through the retina. We try to discern a coherent image, but most of us will be left seeing nothing but an abstract pattern in black and white. Once we hear the words calf's head, however, we have a context. With that little hint, our brains quickly build a model and the image snaps into focus. Our brain, whether it be the sensory system or the motor system, actively constructs the world as it expects it to exist, orientating our bodies in the physical world. What emerges from these multiple complex systems is an all but seamless conscious experience, only that one begins to break down when confronted with ambiguous stimuli. It was perhaps just a sort of uncertainty that appeared when Sherman found himself incapable of grasping the cone. Closing Hector's hand hadn't been a problem when she controlled the arm with fewer degrees of freedom. But when researchers increased her control complexity, the hand began to freeze each time she tried to grab the cone. More mysterious yet, the problem disappeared when Sherman closed her eyes. Without visual input, she could easily grab the cone. But the moment she opened her eyes again, Hector would freeze in place. There was no engineering problem. Hector was fine. He moved gracefully under the computer control. The problem here was neural, and the question for Schwartz became whether learning to interact with objects engaged a different set of brain processes than simply making an arm move. If all Schwartz had wanted to do was make Hector move, he could build a simple neural decoder like the one Wang had used with Heems. Such a decoder would enable Sherman to consistently make certain actions, but it would also be limited. Sherman would only be able to perform a set of number program movements. She wouldn't be able to tailor her actions to specific circumstances or objects. Schwartz wanted something more refined. You don't just have a few cells that turn on to move to the right, he said. The whole population turns on. Some cells fire less. Some cells fire more. But it's that combined activity that is important in generating the movement. Schwartz wanted to craft a brain-machine interface capable of extemporaneous movement to Sherman, who could explore physical space intuitively, reacting to specific objects with unique grasping patterns. His earlier work with Georgia Palulos had shown the importance of neural populations and preferring firing directions. That was fine as long as the control complexity wasn't too advanced. But this new neural hiccup had him thinking something else was at play. There was something specific to the object that was buried in the neural signal that we were missing, he said. Instead of thinking about the way the hand is represented, maybe we should be thinking about what the object is that's represented and what's going to be done with the object. The brain may build lush models of the physical world, complete with expectations of sensation and how our actions will affect objects. But it's one thing to observe the neural storm that occurs as the brain creates a model. It's quite another to try to understand the thousands of spiking neurons within that storm and translate them into a meaningful brain-computer interface. But that was the challenge Schwartz saw before him. In his work with hand shaping in monkeys, Schwartz had attached tracking sensors to the animal's hands and arms. The idea was to record how the limb physically moved as it prepared to interact with the specific objects while he also recorded associated neural activity. Using information from limb movements alone, Schwartz found that he could predict with 99% accuracy what object the monkey was reaching for. But it was in the brain where things got interesting. I can already do object recognition based on motor cortical activity. Not only that, but I can tell you how different the brain thinks different objects are. So you may think that a cylinder and sphere are different objects, but I can look at the neural activity and say, well, the brain doesn't think those are very different, he said. But that's right at the edge of what we know how to do. We're exceeding the bounds of our scientific knowledge. Just how the brain recognizes distinct objects remains a mystery. But a decade earlier, the UCLA neurosurgeon Ishak Freed uncovered a tantalizing clue while performing brain surgery. With the patient under anesthesia, Freed removed a portion of the skull, exposed the brain, and implanted electrodes in the medial temporal lobe, a brain region essential for the conscious memory of facts and events. Once the electrodes were in place, Freed woke his patient, a fairly common surgical technique that enables surgeons to map the brain during surgery. Before proceeding with the operation, however, Freed showed his patient a series of photographs. The researcher wanted to see how the brain reacted to pictures of people it recognized versus images of people it had never encountered. Accordingly, some of the photographs were of well-known celebrities, others were of complete strangers. Fried monitored many neurons as he scrolled through the images, but he noticed that a particular cell spiked like mad whenever the actress Jennifer Aniston appeared on the screen. The neuron quieted down as soon as they removed the photograph. The cell didn't spark to attention at the sight of equally well-known celebrities like Julia Roberts, Bill Clinton, or Halle Berry. Similarly, it was equally unimpressed by photographs of strangers. Intriguingly, the neuron didn't fire when the monitor displayed images of Aniston with Brad Pitt, her husband at the time. But then Fried would present a picture of Aniston again, and the neuron would spike to life. The brain has hundreds of thousands, if not millions of neurons spiking at any given moment. But in this instance, the cell spike the cell spiked only in the presence of Jennifer Aniston, leading neuroscientists to wonder if the neuron was somehow tuned exclusively to the actress. If so, it stood to reason that there would be similarly tuned neurons for everyone a person knew or recognized. And indeed, researchers went on to find neurons that spiked only in the presence of images of Halle Berry, Kobe Bryant, and Julia Roberts. Still, the question remained, did the brain devote specific physical spaces, individual cells, to the recognition of particular people, or was something else at play? The so-called grandmother neuron, shorthand for the idea that individual cells are responsible for recognizing individual people, is a problematic concept. What would happen if your grandmother neuron died? Would you simply be unable to recognize your grandmother? Perhaps more important, though, neuroscientists such as MIT's Sebastian Singh have argued that our general ability to perceive and recognize individual faces is far too complicated a task for a single neuron to perform. They hold instead that cells like the Jennifer Aniston neuron are embedded in neural networks, a piece of a puzzle that comes into place once the others are assembled. At any given moment, an individual brain cell receives chemical signals from hundreds, if not thousands, of connected neurons in its network. As excitatory inhibitory neurotransmitters bathe the receiving cell receptors, they coax the neuron to fire or remain inactive. Essentially, the receiving neuron reaches a tipping point, the magic combination of inputs that prompts the cell to fire. A pulse of electricity courses along the cell's body, which releases neurotransmitters of its own, encouraging nearby neurons to fire or remains at rest. Neurons don't fire in isolation. They fire in networks, and scientists like Sung believe it is the population's ephemeral spiking patterns and not the firing of any one particular cell that underlie perception and memory. A network of several million neurons could create a near infinite number of firing patterns, enabling the brain to recognize countless people, and that's to say nothing of different fruits, dogs, leaf patterns, and so on. A neuron's spiking, then, is wholly dependent on information it receives from the network's momentary configuration. After all, we each exist and think of others in a plethora of wildly different contexts. There's the physical, which might be someone's hair, the color of his eyes, or the shape of his nose. Add to that the sound of the person's voice, his gait, and his distinctive movement patterns. But there are also less tangible aspects we associate with a person. For a celebrity like Aniston, those might be her failed marriage to Brad Pitt or her role as Rachel in Friends. Let's describe Jen as a combination of simpler parts, writes Singh in his book Connect Gnome. She has blue eyes, blonde hair, an angular chin, and so on, as of this writing anyway. If the list is long enough, it will uniquely describe Jen and no other celebrity. In Singh's telling, the Aniston neuron is the final link in the neural network. The cell's firing threshold is extremely high, and it must receive synapses from all of the contributing neurons, the right blue eye neurons, the blonde hair neurons, and the angular chin neurons. The lower down the chain, it spikes only when all of the part neurons spike, a unanimous vote that happens only in response to gin. In short, a neuron detects gin as a combination of gin parts, which are detected by other neurons. Singh's theory of perception is hierarchical. The blue eye neuron receives the synaptic inputs from neurons tuned to ever simpler parts, a neuron for the white of the eye, a neuron for the pupil, the iris, the eyelid, the eyelash, and so on, eventually reaching neurons that are tuned to the stimuli that can't be further reduced, like horizontal lines and spots of light and shadow. These simpler neurons are not devoted exclusively to aniston. To the contrary, they're at the ready to register blues in the line in the sky or the blue irises of others. It's only when a magic combination of these lower neurons fire that we register aniston. The so-called aniston neuron fires then not as the sole witness to the celebrity, but more like a light that flashes vigorously in response to a specific pattern of lesser lights. Be that as it may, researchers have found that cells like the aniston neuron do not fire only when a person sees a photograph of the person in question. In subsequent experiments, Fried found these neurons fired with equally intensity when he simplified displayed the name of the person on the computer, suggesting perhaps that the cell makes no distinction between the symbolic representation of the person and the sight of the person. Fried and Singh are talking about perception, recognition, and memory, but for Schwartz, the aniston neuron might point to a neural principle that applied equally to movement, not only for the immediate question of why Sherman was unable to grasp objects, but more fundamentally how we conceive and interact with the physical world. The question is whether Jennifer Aniston is built up of features, a certain shaped nose and distance between the eyes, and its conjunction of features that leads to Jennifer Aniston. Or is it a symbolic thing, he wondered. Do we have a symbolic idea of Jennifer Aniston? Seen slightly different, this was the same question he was asking about objects and how we interact with them. Simpler brain-computer interfaces concentrated on the limb, assigning various movements. Schwartz had achieved unprecedented control over robot arms using population vectors. But as the arm's control complexity increased, he was no longer certain his tried and true method could accommodate the brain's symbolic conception of the physical world. He was becoming convinced that he had to think of movement in increasingly abstract or symbolic terms. Instead of merely looking at the preferred firing direction and population of neurons, Schwartz wondered if he needed to take intention into account. Namely, how did Sherman play to interact with an object? After all, we'll grab a box very differently if we plan to open it as opposed to lift it. In the movement, we begin reaching for a box. We are already planning our trajectory. Not only are we orientating it in our relation to ourselves, but we are also determining how much force we will use, the speed of our movement, and how to shape our hand. We're simultaneously forming expectations of how the object will respond. Will the bottom of the box sag? Will it be warm? Will it be firm? Will opening up the top require all of our fingers? Will we need our one hand or two? It would be like what your intended use of the object is, he said. If I was going to pick up a cup to drink, I might pick it up more gently. But if I'm going to throw it, I'll pick it up differently. That sort of symbolic action is probably represented in the brain. The question then was not merely whether the brain creates specific representations for different objects. Rather, does the brain create different representations for the same object? Just as the brain makes predictions to fill blind spots in our vision, so too does it create predictive models as we physically interact with the outside world. Those models are never objective, they depend entirely on how we intend to interact with the physical world. These experiential preview this experiential preview is continuously updated by sensory information. But as long as the sensory information doesn't contradict our internal model, we rarely become aware of the complex coordination of muscles and joints and bones it takes to interact with the physical environment. Thinking of climbing limbs, think of climbing a flight of steps. We rarely think about how high to lift our leg, how much force to exert on our foot, or the incline of our body against the stairs. We spent a lifetime climbing steps, and we're on autopilot as we depend on our brain's symbolic representation of the physical environment to carry us through. But occasionally we miscalculate. We think there's another step at the top or that the rise is slightly lower. We stumble, and as the sensory information streaming up our peripheral nervous system contradicts our internal model, conscious awareness comes online. That's the job of sensation, said Schwartz. What you're doing is always predicting what's going to happen in the future. But as long as the physical world conforms to our expectations, we're happy to go about our business, driving to work with no memory of how we got there, absent-mindedly taking a sip from our water bottle, with little conscious awareness of what our bodies are doing. Could it be that Schumann, who could watch but receive no sensory feedback from Hector, was unable to grasp objects because her neural modeling was being contradicted by a lack of sensory feedback? After all, with her eyes open, she could see the arm move, but this visual information wasn't accompanied by sensation. Did that somehow interrupt the internal model? Faced with the bare physicality of the cones, perhaps Sherman was simply thinking too consciously about the grasp. Perhaps her conscious brain was confusing with the computer by overriding her internal neural model. There was no question that motor neurons are associated with movement, but it was becoming increasingly clear to Schwartz the motor cortex and our physical interaction with the world were inextricably linked to intention and the creation of predictive models. We have these ideas that neurons fire in a certain way because they're trying to move an arm. But that's an assumption on our part, he said. What if that's not really what they're doing? Chapter 11, Frozen Mirrors. Much has been made of mirror neurons since Giacomo Rizzolatti first discovered the cells in his Parma laboratory. Rizzolatti was recording from the brains of monkeys, and researchers have since found similar cells in several areas of the primate brain, including both the sensory and the motor cortices. What's remarkable about the mirror neurons and what they're named for is their ability to recreate what we see in the world. When we wince at the sight of a vicious tickle, the mirror neurons in our sensory cortex come to life. When we're at the edge of our seats during a tennis match, mirror neurons in our motor cortex are firing away. These neurons, which some scientists believe account for 20% of cells in some areas of the macaque motor cortex, do not merely allow us to experience vicariously the crush of a tackle or the smash of a ball. Rather, as part of the motor cortex, they are among the population of cells that spike each time we ourselves hit a tennis ball. They are not mere witnesses, they are members of the neural population associated with the actions themselves. And scientists theorize that by spiking at the side of a tennis player hitting a forehand, these cells at some level recreate the swing itself, enabling us to actually experience the swing as though it were our own. We may not have Rafael Nadal's refined motor skills to expertly hit a forehand, but we are all familiar with the gross physical action of swinging. We make those sorts of movements throughout our lives. We can approximate Nadal's movement, enabling us to understand and identify with his actions. In that sense, to watch Nadal play tennis is, at least neurally, to play the game ourselves. But neuroscientists believe the cell's recreation of physical movements and sensations is not confined to large physical gestures. These exquisitely tuned cells are also sensitive to subtlest shift in another person's face and demeanor. When we see someone's eyes tighten in distress or the corner of his mouth turn up in flirtation, we are right there with him, mirroring his emotion. We understand his intentions and state of mind because, as Bill Clinton would have it, we feel his pain. This facet of the mirror system has prompted many neuroscientists to theorize that it is cellular foundation of human empathy, an essential building block of our shared humanity. Mirror neurons undoubtedly provide, for the first time in history, a plausible neurophysiological explanation for complex forms of social cognition and interaction, writes the neuroscientist Marco Iccobani in his book on the cells mirroring people. By helping us recognize the actions of other people, mirror neurons also help us to recognize and understand the deepest motives behind those actions, the intentions of other individuals. In essence, these cells offer a biological answer to a question that has vexed philosophers for centuries. Namely, how do we know that other people have beliefs, emotions, knowledge, or desires that are distinct from our own? And while we're only just beginning to understand the roles these cells play in our understanding of other people, Ikebani is not alone when he argues that the mirror system is a biological mechanism behind simulation theory, a philosophical concept that we recognize and understand the mental states of others, their intentions, their desires, and their beliefs by imagining them ourselves. Of course, it's one thing to recoil when we see footage of the University of Louisville basketball player Kevin Ware collapse in agony as his tibia snaps in half. It's quite another to develop a nuanced understanding of another person's mental state. So far, the bulk of the research on mirror neurons has performed in monkeys where, as we know, the cells react to physical gestures of others. But do monkeys feel sympathy for their fellow primates? Do they understand the frustration of their cage mates, their happiness, their guilt? In a word, do monkeys have theory of mind where we are left guessing? Be that as it may, neuroscientists like Rizzolatti and Akabani theorize that human neuron systems have become more advanced than those of our primate cousins, enabling us to have a deep social intelligence that's capable of neurally inhabiting the minds of others. In the years that Rizzolatti's team was first exploring the mirror system, the Italian lab was simultaneously investigating a related set of cells known as conical neurons, which they found in the same area of the brain. Like mirror neurons, conical neurons fired whenever monkeys made a grasping gesture. What set conical neurons apart, however, was that they also spiked in the same grasping pattern when the animal merely saw a graspable object. These twin findings, which played out over the years in Rossetti's lab, indicated that both humans and monkeys couldn't observe an action or an object without brains unspooling a motor plan of physical interaction. Think about that. If mirror neurons suggest that our brains perceive the actions of others through cellular reenactment, conical neurons indicate that our perception of inanimate objects is intrinsically bound to our physical interaction with the object. In short, Akabani writes, the grasping actions and motor plans necessary to obtain and eat a piece of fruit are inherently linked to our very understanding of the fruit. The firing pattern shows clearly that perception and action are not separated in the brain. Akabani writes that subsequent brain imaging studies have dug even deeper, showing that mirror neurons not only mimic the observed actions of others, but also will become active at the very mention of an action. In one fMRI experiment, UCLA researchers asked test subjects to read sentences describing specific gestures associated with eating and grabbing fruit. During the same study, they showed the test subjects video of people eating and grabbing fruit. They found that when people either read about or watched people eating, areas of the motor cortex associated with mouth and hand movements became active. In a similar brain imaging study, Dutch researchers had volunteers listen to someone crunching potato chips or ripping a piece of paper. Researchers watched as neurons in volunteers' premotor cortices sparked to life at the sounds. Test subjects were then given potato chips to eat and sheets of paper to tear. Once again, the same cells that were active at the sounds of eating and tearing became active as the volunteers ate the potato chips and tore pieces of paper. Mirror neurons transform what you see or hear. Mirror neurons transform what you see or hear other people do into what you would do yourself. The study's principal investigator, the neuroscientist Christian Kiesers, told Discover magazine, "You start to really feel what it feels like to do a similar action." Rizzolatti's research, along with a host of subsequent investigations into the mirror and conical systems, has had profound implications for more traditional conceptions of brain function, which held that cognition was somehow higher and separate from motor function. These remarkable cells seem to work double duty. They help coordinate physical movement while also contributing to cognition. They indicate that we don't merely conceive of people and objects around us as distinct from ourselves. Rather, physical interaction with our environment is essential to our perception and understanding. Planning for motion is primitive brain construct that lower animals have, said Nicolelis. We have evolved the idea of planning actions way ahead of time. Considering the risk, our ability to plan things out, to strategize, that all started with motion. The question for Schwartz was how motor cortical cells coded for different objects and actions. Again, Rizzolatti's earlier studies held valuable clues, taking brain recordings while his monkeys performed grasping actions. Rizzolatti found that neurons in the premotor cortex weren't terribly concerned with whether the monkey was using its left or right hand to grasp an object. The first firing patterns for these very different actions weren't too diverse. Where the researchers did see a difference, however, was in the type of grip the monkey employed. The animal's motor neurons would produce one pattern when grasping a small object and very different one while grasping something large. Rizzolatti's research seemed to indicate that it was the size of the object, not the object itself, that mattered to the brain. The neuron that fired at the side of an apple slice would not automatically fire at the side of a whole apple. On the other hand, the neuron that fired at the side of an apple slice would also fire at the side of an orange section. Similarly, the neuron that fired at the side of an apple would also fire at the side of an orange. Was the brain simply coding for size and hand grip? After all, we grab a whole apple quite differently than we grab a small slice. Rizzolatti's early experimenters also involved food, oranges, apples, peanuts, and so on. Taking intention into account, was it possible a monkey would perceive all food equally? That is, both apples and oranges are objects to be brought to the mouth and eaten. If so, it could be that the monkey's brain made no distinction between the two objects, representing them both as food. The difference in motor cortical activation would then involve only the physical details of bringing the apple to its mouth. Should the animal grab the fruit with its whole hand as would an entire apple, or should it use a more refined pinch to grasp a slice? But what about intention? Would the brain activate differently while grabbing an orange section than it would while reaching for a similar sized non-edible object? That was precisely the question the neuroscientist Leo Fagassi set out to answer a few years ago with a simple reaching task. In the first part of the experiment, Fagassi, who was a member of Rosselotti's original group, had his monkeys reach for pieces of food to eat. For the second phase, he had the animals reach for similarly sized objects, which they placed in a container by their mouths. The physical action of grasping to eat and grasping to place in the container were nearly identical, enabling Fagasse and his fellow researchers to concentrate on whether the animals' brains coded differently for edible versus inedible objects. They were testing for intention, listening in on animals' premotor cortices. Fagasse found that around 60% of the neurons he recorded in the experiment registered different spiking patterns when the animal reached for food versus when the animal reached for the inedible objects. To further clarify the data, Fagasse repeated the experiment, this time using only food. In the first phase, he had the monkey grab food to eat. In the second, he had them grab food to place in the container. Once again, the physical actions were very similar, and Fagasse found that again his monkeys coded differently for objects that would eat versus objects that would place in the container. The physical object Fagasse research seemed to suggest mattered less to the brain than how we intended to interact with it. Fagasse's study didn't stop there. In the next phase, scientists took neural recordings as the monkeys watched researchers perform similar actions. Grabbing food to eat in one phase, placing it in a container in the next. Once again, the animal's premotor cortices erupted into a distinct pattern, while observing someone grasping food to eat versus grasping food to place in the container. What's more, the neural activations were similar to when the monkeys performed the actions themselves. The monkeys were coding for intention in the observed researchers, whether to eat or to place a piece of food. Findings like Fagasse's have prompted neuroscientists and philosophers to theorize that these cells are much more than a mechanism to understand the actions of others. Rather, they are a cellular mechanism we use to divine the mental states, the intentions of others. And while mirror neurons may serve as biological underpinning of human empathy, Schwartz believed there was another reason we evolved this sort of embodied consciousness: our own safety. You're always trying to predict what's going to happen next. You're watching the way other people move. You're placing their movements in relation to yourself. And you're asking yourself, if it was that person, what would I be doing next? He said. Why do you do that? Because the most dangerous things in the world are the people around you. There's a huge evolutionary drive to do that, the same as we are always trying to predict what's going to happen if we touch an object in a certain way. Schwartz had to come a long way from the challenging notion that the motor cortex as merely a control center to move muscles that he was describing was an essential link between our cognitive representation of the physical world. Gross physical movement and behavior. He was moving toward an idea of embodied consciousness, a consciousness whose variability as perceive objects and recognize the consciousness of other people is dependent on our own corporality, our own ability to move, our physical form and interaction with objects and other people. It's merely the foundation of our consciousness. They are consciousness itself. Instead of thinking of movement purely in terms of mechanics, you can think of it as a behavioral output, he said. It's not just that the brain is acting as a command center. It is the fact that your physical structure determines your behavior. So the way you are constructed, the way we stand upright on our two legs, are too free to move our arms and hands so that they are not supporting the body. That allows us to do a whole range of behaviors that other animals can't do. Still, observing the brain code objects differently based on intention was a far cry from crafting a brain-computer interface to accommodate this symbolic construction of the world. Nevertheless, Schwartz was increasingly convicted that he would have to take an idea of embodied cognition into account if he was ever to create a brain-computer interface capable of robust and spontaneous movement. He could not think of only moving joint angles and pairing specific neural activity to particular actions. After Perhaps even population vectors and preferring firing directions wouldn't be enough. Perhaps he would have to decode how the embodied brain symbolically perceives the physical world. After all, he'd done everything right from a technical standpoint. Using population vectors, he had already granted Sherman 7 degrees of freedom. He knew that mechanically, at least, he'd solved the problem of movement. So how else could he explain Sherman's sudden inability to grasp physical objects? Was it merely a bug, or were her motor neurons somehow tied to higher order thoughts? A complicated relationship that surfaced only when her neural control of the arm began to rival the complexity and grace of natural movement. Like Nicolelis, he would need to record from more neurons. These questions continued to swirl in Schwartz's mind, but his DARPA funders wanted results. They had him on a strict deadline for his deliverables, and he needed the arm to work. He was essentially the small end of the funnel. After more than 6 years of planning, untold hours of hard work by hundreds of researchers, and tens of millions of government dollars on the line, it all came down to him. Schwartz had to deliver, so while he continued to puzzle over Sherman's inability to grasp, he moved her daily calibration exercise to virtual reality, where Sherman used Hector's ghostly avatar to do what she could not in the physical world: grasp and release. It was a mystery, more mysterious yet. Not long after she switched to the virtual realm, the problem disappeared completely. Sherman's brain made some type of adjustment, and she was able again to grasp physical objects. Chapter 12. Piano Man. Ah, rock crushes scissors, Schumann crowed. As Hector, the arm's hand in a fist, retracted to its resting position. Draped in a polka dot fleece, Schumann was in the midst of vanquishing her opponent in a game of rock, paper, scissors. Her biological arms, pale, cool, flaccid, rested on a pillow beneath the fleece, while her head, Sherman's last outpost of bodily command, lay against her wheelchair's headrest. She hadn't moved on her own for nearly 15 years. Relying instead on the rugged motorized wheelchair she piloted with a shoulder-mounted joystick as she controlled with her chin. Sherman had spent the morning coaxing Hector through a series of elegant arcs, naturalistic reaches, and dexterous grabs, stacking boxes and fitting pegs in a board. Now perched and at the ready, the arm sat off to the side in one of Schwartz's windowless labs. The average human brain teems with some 100 billion neurons that collectively shimmer with electrochemical consciousness. No one knows how these 3 pounds of tissue and electricity awash in a chemical bath of neurotransmitters result in consciousness, but we do know that delicate yet routine tasks like pinching a few strands of saffron are in fact the collaborative result of thousands of individual neurons that speak to one another. Information moves like sheet lightning across the brain, forming transient patterns of activity that expand and recede as specific clusters of neurons spark other clusters into action. Sherman, by contrast, was using fewer than 200 cells to control Hector, meaning her broad movements often appeared effortless. But her finger motor skills? Let's just say the system could be a little buggy. Nevertheless, Sherman was already up by 1 in her game of rock, paper, scissors. Her opponent figured she'd play to her cyborg strength, urging Hector to flatten for paper instead of forming a more challenging scissor or fist again for rock. Scissors beat paper, so that was the plan. 1, 2, she counted as she clapped his fist into the palm. 3. But as her opponent began to extend his fingers, Hector's network of tiny motors whirred into action. Milliseconds earlier, Sherman had imagined extending the middle and index fingers of her right hand. That intention prompted a cracking network of neurons to fire across her brain. The conversation volleyed across her neocortex, but its meaning was not was most pronounced in the motor strip, where Lewis and Clark, twin listening posts, transmitted the Morse code like patterns to the beefy gray cables that sprouted horn-like from Sherman's skull. Those cables ferried the electrical pulses of individual neurons to the bank of computers that squatted in the left of Sherman's chair. As the signals flowed into the humming cube of black machines, they cascaded across the algorithms that parsed the rat-a-tat-tat of scores of individually firing neurons. The algorithm compared the frequency and amplitude of some neurons with that of others, assessing the emergent firing pattern and transforming it into a series of commands for Hector. It all happened in a matter of milliseconds, roughly the amount of time it would take a biologically intact nervous system to do the same thing. And as Sherman's opponent spread his fingers to form a pair of scissors, Sherman, her platinum electrodes, gold wires, signal amplifiers, fiber optic cables, and powerful computers, combining as Hector buzzed forward, matched him digit for digit as the arm unfurled a slender pair of black fingers. "Tie!" Sherman cried as Hector retreated to his neutral crouch. Down by one, her challenger decided to play it safe. Sherman might be a little clumsy with the finer motor tasks, but she was also having a terrific breakthrough sort of day. An hour earlier, she had begun moving, Hector smoothly, with a full 10 degrees of control, not only a fluid motion that rivaled a natural human arm, but also an exponential advance over anything John Donahue or Miguel Nicolelis had shown to date. She was feeling cocky. She might showboat a little, exhausting the game's repertoire by flattening Hector for paper. Scissors beat paper, of course, so that was the plan. Scissors again. But 15 years in a wheelchair had transformed Sherman into a fearsome gamer, and as everyone in the room was about to find out, no slouch at rock, paper, scissors either. "One," she chanted as Hector's motors began to hum. "Two," Sherman called. "Three." Her opponent struck the heel of his right hand into the palm of his left, forming a V with his middle and index fingers. But Sherman had anticipated the plan. Hector balled into a fist. "Rock beats scissors," she cried. The game was over. "Next week I'm going to feed myself chocolate," she said, satisfied as Hector coiled to neutral. "We'll probably need a lot of chocolate." Schwartz had done it, working for the first time with penetrating electrodes in humans. He'd not merely achieved the study's stated goal of 7 degrees of freedom, he'd surpassed it at their peak. Sherman and Hector moved with the full 10 degrees of freedom. Schwartz and his colleagues eventually published those findings in 2013 in the British scientific journal Lancet under the title "High Performance Neuroprosthetic Control by an Individual with Tetraplegia." By now, Schwartz was prepared for the inevitable media deluge that followed. As 60 Minutes and other news outlets featured the work, Sherman was a little more starstruck as she gave interviews and prepared to be featured on national television. "If you Google my name, I've been in a paper in Switzerland, front page above the fold," she said. "I've been on the BBC, I've been on the CBC, and all 3 local papers. I'm just all over the place." "The attention didn't hurt," said Schumann. Once so despondent, she spent the weeks leading up to the 60 Minutes segment meticulously plotting her social media campaign to drum up interest. On Monday, she'd post a picture on Facebook of her and the correspondent Scott Pelley. "What am I doing here with Scott Pelley?" she planned to post. "Oh yeah, that's because I'm going to be on 60 Minutes." She had recruited a few friends as plants. One of them is going to ask, "Is it because of your book, Sharp as a Cucumber?" And I will say, "What? You mean this book?" And I'll post a link to my Amazon page. On Wednesday, she'd post a picture of a chocolate bar. On Friday, she'd post her Halloween costume, 2 figurine-sized ghosts placed atop Lewis and Clark. She was having a ball. "I plan to ride the wave all week," she said. "I'm sure I'll have tons of comments." Schwartz was more measured, whereas he'd once dreaded talking to the media. He'd learned to better present his work. You give them what they want, the usual thing. But then at the end, you say, but what's really cool is that this is allowing us to probe the brain and learn things that we weren't able to do before, he said. I mean, it's great to watch our subject move. It's very pleasing. It's emotional. But the thing that drives me is the science. We got it to work. Let's move on. But there was no denying it. Schwartz was pleased with the study. He'd spent his entire career waiting for this moment. Now that it was here, he was less concerned with the public attention than he was with the small group of researchers he counted as colleagues. Schwartz was finally on top. Donahue and Nicolelis might have been first, but neither of them had achieved anything approaching his elegance or complexity of control. Look at that, he said, watching a video of Sherman and Hector. That is precise. Impressive, huh? That's the real thing. I'm not shooting smoke, man. He would continue to work with DARPA, trying to recruit new patients the program planned to implant with wireless interfaces and endow with a digital sense of touch, but Schwartz felt that in some essential way he'd done it. He'd unlocked part of the mystery of movement. The paper conclusively shows that that is reality. It's validated that concept, he said. There's more work to be done and everything, but I think that just about everybody would be convinced that it can happen, that it will happen. The effort, some 35 years in the making, had done well by him. Schwartz was undeniably a star in his rarefied realm. He had appeared in every major media outlet. He traveled the world to present his work at conferences. DARPA was DARPA was thrilled with his progress, and he now boasted one of the biggest, most advanced neuroscience labs in the world. Still, other mysteries remain, and Schwartz was growing tired of the BCI race. Maybe I'm just getting older, but I just feel more secure, he said. I don't want to overblow it, but it's like I'm in an athletic thing. You've won some sort of contest. I kind of feel like I've proven myself, and that's satisfying. He now longed for the simpler days when he was first starting out and built his own task chair to start a monkey lab. Back then, he worked with one lab tech and one monkey. He had reconfigured an early touchscreen from an ATM to use in his experiments. He built all of his equipment. He did all of his own programming. He trained his own monkey. He hadn't had to teach, and he didn't supervise anyone. It was pure research, just Schwartz and his monkey. It was fantastic, completely hands-on, he said. When we finished, the technician and we got a bottle of champagne, and I had our picture taken with that monkey, my first monkey. Now, after years spent chasing his neuroprosthetic dream, Schwartz wanted a return to those robots, diving deeper into the brain's mysteries. He wanted to discover what he believed was the holy grail of neuroscience, namely the underlying principles that cause the cell to produce an action potential. Any given neuron is connected to some 10,000 other cells, many of which are firing and releasing neurotransmitters to the receiving cell. If enough of those surrounding cells are active and their activity is intense enough, the receiving cells will generate an action potential. But why is that? Are they different neurons communicating every time? Is every neuron equal, or are some guys special? He asked. Is it always the same synapses? Do their inputs have preferred directions? And the ones that fire together in a certain way are the ones that make these guys fire? Or is there some other rule, an algebraic sum? It's no idle question. As neuron challenge allegiances become more associated with some cells than with others, neuroplastic brain is not merely changing its physiology. It is learning, changing its physical makeup to alter its behavior. Schwartz had shown this process again and again with BCIs, prompting subjects to alter their brain's firing patterns to better control a device. Now he wanted to go deeper. He didn't want to merely observe cells change. He wanted to investigate the fundamental synaptic mechanism that underlies that change. He wanted to know why a cell fires. And I have the experiment now that I can do to answer that question, he said. It would take just one monkey. Schwartz could do it in his lab's basement, mapping a neuron's synaptic connections to investigate how those synapses shifted their behavior, prompting a change in the receiving cell. Would the cell stop generating action potentials when a specific synapse stopped releasing neurotransmitters? Was it simply a numbers game, or were there essential synaptic combinations without which the cell will not fire? Schwartz didn't merely to watch the brain learn anymore. He wanted to understand this most fundamental subcellular mechanism that makes not only learning, but also movement, emotions, reason, perception, ideas, fantasies, and dreams possible. Maybe it won't pan out, he said, but I'd sure like to give it a shot. I mean, we have no idea what makes a neuron fire, and that's at the root of everything. Epilogue. Each year, scientists from around the country meet for the Society for Neuroscience Conference, the field's largest meeting where researchers unveil their latest findings and size up competition. Held in New Orleans in 2012, the SFN conference took place before Schwartz had published his findings. His lab had criticized earlier for talking to the press about their work with hemes before publishing the results in the academic journal. But by then, Schwartz had already achieved 10 degrees of freedom with Sherman, and he roamed the halls of cavernous Ernest M. Memorial Convention Center, showing a select group of colleagues videos on his smartphone. While the Schwartz group hadn't formally published its findings, it's presented a poster of its work, where Donahue, Hochberg, Sluthart, Moran, and the rest of the field could see the preliminary results. Conspicuously absent from the meeting was Nicolaides. I only go to SFN every 2 years because I find it so repetitive, he said later. It's not worth taxpayers' money to go. Nevertheless, just as Hochberg and Donahue had been the stars of the Neural Interfaces Conference back in Salt Lake City, a small group of BCI researchers was abuzz over Schwartz's research. On the third night of the conference, many of the field's brightest stars gathered for a party in the courtyard of the House of Blues, where the drink list titled Beverage Computer Interfaces offered everything from non-invasive beverages like seltzer and Diet Coke to neuro takes on drinks classics like the Eric Lemonheart, vodka and lemon, the Cosmopolitan Donahue, a Cosmopolitan, and Nico's Network, a whiskey sour. Everyone here is a competitor, Hochberg said in a brief moment of candor away from the crowd. Nevertheless, he and the rest of the researchers were all in a festive mood that night. Schwartz might have struck hard with the Schumann's research, but Hochberg, dressed in a roomy pinstripe suit, was carrying in his pocket the future of the field, a matchbook-sized prototype of a wireless telemetry device. It should be a nice continuation of that field, he allowed. By then, Luthart was well on his way with Neurolutions, the BCI-based company he'd started with Moran and Schalk. They were in the midst of fabricating the IPSI hand, the orthotic device they hoped would enable BCI stroke patients to regain function. Toggling as always between his surgery practice and his research, Luthart had added funding raising to his repertoire. Meeting with potential investors and medical device manufacturers. Still, he was in the midst of getting the study approved. Medical school administrators were hesitant to sign off on an academic study that could potentially benefit a private company. Conflict of interest affects everybody, he said. It's really this war of two cultures. If you were to divest yourself of all financial interest in the company, investors couldn't just understand that. The university would eventually sign off on Luhart's study, whose preliminary results have been promising. In the meantime, Brookman, who returned home to Tulsa after the surgery, was slowly recuperating, working with speech and physical therapists to regain some of the function he'd lost after the second operation. His was a long and halting recovery, and he still struggled to control Tourette's syndrome and bipolar disorder. Nevertheless, the surgery itself had been an unequivocal success. After the surgery, it's like boom. I stopped having seizures immediately, he said. More than a year after this procedure, Brookman had not suffered a single epileptic episode. Luthart had since worked with several other research subjects, and his lab presented posters of their work using ECOG BCIs to interpret speech and recreate motor activity. Still, Luthart was running up against the same issues Schwartz and the rest of the field encountered with BCIs. Sure, they could recreate movement, but was that enough? Did they really understand the underlying mechanism? I've seen a lot of what I call information transfer functions. He said at lunch earlier that day, I take brain activity and predict finger movements, but it's an informational transfer. You put in the variables and the machine learning algorithm spits out its ability to predict. But it doesn't tell you what's going on. It's a black box. At the party, however, these larger concerns were put away for the night. Hochberg gave a speech and presented an award, while Donahue and Schwartz mingled with their respective labs. This uneasy fellowship had called a truce for the night, and as scientists slowly retired to their hotels, Gerwin Schock lingered in the doorway. The former football player was dressed in a red John Lennon t-shirt, stabbing at the air as he talked with fellow researchers. Sure, their BCIs recreate movement, but to what end? How would their results be translated into a marketable device? They're just so enthralled with their neurons, he said, but that's only the first 10% of the work. That completes the book.